Before he became America's hero, George Washington lost his first battle in a muddy clearing he dared to call Fort Necessity. He was 22, ambitious, hungry for glory. He marched into the dark forests of Pennsylvania with a handful of British regulars and colonial militia, convinced that courage and a quick attack would be enough to push France out of the frontier. Instead, he fired the first shots of a war he didn't understand, killed a French officer he wasn't supposed to touch, and provoked an international crisis between two empires. Caught in the open, soaked by relentless rain, surrounded by French troops and native warriors who knew the woods far better than he did, Washington watched his fort flood with water and blood. By nightfall, the future first president of the United States was sitting in a leaking stockade, signing a surrender document written in a language he couldn't read, a document that secretly branded him as an assassin. This is the story of the day George Washington wasn't a legend or a face on a dollar bill, but a young, overconfident officer who learned the hard way how quickly the frontier can chew up even the bravest men, and how one forgotten defeat in a swampy meadow lit the fuse for a war that would reshape the world. Long before he became a statue in every city or a face on money, George Washington was just the tall, quiet son of a minor Virginia planter who wanted to be somebody in a world ruled by other men's names. Mid-18th century Virginia was not a land of equals. It was a world of ancient English titles, plantation dynasties, men whose last names carried more weight than any rank printed on a piece of paper. Washington did not belong to the top tier. His family had land, yes, but not that kind of land. Not the vast river-spanning estates of the Fairfaxes or the Randolphs or the Carters. His father died when he was still young. The inheritance split. The great house he might have grown into went to someone else. From the beginning, George Washington grew up with a taste of privilege and the burning awareness that it wasn't fully his. He was close enough to power to see it, but not close enough to own it. That does something to a young man. Before he wore a uniform, Washington learned a different kind of skill. He became a surveyor. It sounds dull on paper. In reality, it meant this: long days in the backcountry, walking ridges and valleys no European had named, sleeping under the open sky, in forests full of wolves, rumors and people who were there long before the king's paper maps, measuring land that other men would later fight over with signatures, and then with muskets. Surveying hardened him. The boots, the cold, the wet, the distances across mountains and rivers, the constant calculation: how far, how high, how many miles of wilderness between here and safety. It also did something to his imagination. He saw rich valleys where no English fences yet stood, great rivers that could carry trade and fortunes, forests that looked infinite to men who grew up watching soil tire and fields thin. To Washington, the frontier was not just empty land, it was the future. And futures are always owned by the men who get there first. Behind the curtain of these maps and measurements, another force was working: speculation. Powerful Virginians, including men Washington admired, had formed a company with a simple aim: claim land in the Ohio Valley before the French or anyone else do. On a globe, the Ohio Valley looks like just another patch of green. On an 18th century power map, it is something else entirely. A gateway to the interior of the continent, a corridor of rivers that could connect colonies, trade routes, empires, a space that could feed millions and export wealth across an ocean. The French, moving down from Canada, saw it as their natural backyard. The British, creeping west from the Atlantic, saw it as theirs. The people already living there, Shawnee, Delaware, Mingo, and many others, knew it was more than a colored patch on a European chart. It was home. Into this crowded, invisible war of claims stepped a tall young Virginian with careful manners, ambition he never quite admitted out loud, and the desperate need to make a name before life decided his place for him. He had no aristocratic title, but he had something almost as useful in Virginia: height, presence, and connections. He was noticed by the right people at the right dinners, and when the colony's militia needed officers, men who could ride, command, and look like authority even when they were barely more than boys, George Washington was exactly the kind of figure that fit the costume. The red coat did something to him. It gave shape to his ambition. Rank could be earned. Reputation could be built. A man's name could be carried not by birthright, but by reports and dispatches and victories. Then, in 1753, the storms that had been rumbling over the Ohio finally broke. The French had not only claimed the territory, they had started to build forts, real ones with timber and guns, anchors of power on contested soil. The governor of Virginia, resentful and worried, needed to send a message. This land belongs to the British Crown. Leave. Choosing who would deliver that message was a decision loaded with symbolism. He chose Washington, not the most experienced man, but young, tough, able to survive the journey, eager to impress. The task was dangerous and prestigious. Cross hundreds of miles of winter wilderness. Find French commanders deep in the forest. Deliver a formal protest on behalf of a king. Bring back their answer. If Washington succeeded, he would no longer be just a provincial surveyor. He'd be the man who went into the frozen wilds to stare down France for Virginia. He accepted. Of course he did. Snow, cold that burns the lungs, rivers crusted with treacherous ice, forest trails half buried, half erased. Washington sets out with a small party, interpreters, guides, a few companions to share the risk. In the Ohio country, they pass through native villages where decisions about alliance and neutrality will shape the entire war. He realizes quickly, this is not just Britain versus France. It's a web of nations who know the land far better than any European. Still, he pushes on. Days blur into weeks. They find the French. They find the fort. Washington stands in front of officers who serve a different king, under a different flag, in the same endless forest. He hands over Virginia's demand. The French read it, set it aside, and politely hand him their answer. A refusal. But not just a simple no. A confident one. The French too know what the Ohio means. They're not leaving. Washington notes everything, the number of cannons, the strength of the fort, the mood of the officers, the subtle sense that the French feel no immediate fear of Virginia's response. Then he turns back toward home. The journey is worse going back. At one point, his raft overturns in an icy river. He nearly drowns. He spends a night on a small island, clothes frozen to his body. He survives because he's tough, lucky, and too stubborn to die frozen and anonymous in the middle of nowhere. When he finally returns to Williamsburg, he isn't just alive. He's useful. He brings maps in his head, notes in his journal, a clear report. The French are there. They are serious. They will not simply walk away. The governor publishes his account. In London, people read the name Washington for the first time. For the young officer, this winter mission feels like a beginning. He has gone into the forest carrying the crown's message and come back with proof that war is coming. He has tasted danger, frostbite, the thin line between glory and a frozen grave. He expects that next time, he'll be part of the force that pushes the French back. He does not know that the next time he rides into that frontier, his name will be tied not to a proud report, but to a disaster in a muddy meadow that he will spend the rest of his life quietly trying to outgrow. In London and Paris, men in powdered wigs discuss boundaries on maps they've never seen, rivers they couldn't pronounce right if their lives depended on it, claims and charters and treaties drawn with ink. In native councils, leaders discuss something else. Which European power is less dangerous this year? Which alliance might protect their people for one more generation? Whether these red-coated newcomers will ever stop coming. In Virginia, planters and officials read Washington's report and feel a mix of anger and excitement. Anger that the French dared to sit on their land. Excitement that a conflict might open new paths to wealth and rank. The frontier is about to become a line of fire. Washington, still only in his early 20s, stands in the perfect place to be sucked into the center of it. He knows the trails. He knows the rivers. He has seen the enemy forts with his own eyes. He wants, more than anything, to prove himself worthy of command. So when the next call comes, this time not to talk, but to fight, He does not hesitate. The boy who delivered a letter will now lead men. The surveyor who measured land in chains and rods will now measure it in yards of effective musket range. The young man who nearly froze in the Ohio winter will soon discover that there is something worse than cold and hunger on the frontier. Being surrounded in the rain, under fire, inside a fort so badly chosen and badly built that history will remember it by the bitterest name possible: Fort Necessity. By the spring of 1754, the forest that Washington had crossed as a messenger was no longer just a frontier. It was disputed territory, and disputed territory has a way of turning young officers into matches striking against rock. Virginia's governor had a new order. Go back to the Ohio, build a fort, show the flag. If the French push, push back. Nothing in that sounded on paper like the beginning of a global conflict. For Washington, it was an opportunity. Command a small force. Build a post in strategically important land. Be the man whose name appears in every report. He gathered a few dozen Virginia militiamen, farmers, frontiersmen, not professional soldiers, some pack animals, tools, and the idea of a fort more than the fort itself. They were not marching as a polished army. They were walking as a clumsy spear thrust into the green skin of the forest. The objective was simple: reach the forks of the Ohio, where two rivers met to form the Great Ohio River, and claim it before the French. Washington believed they were simply moving faster in a race of flags and shovels. He did not yet grasp just how far the French had already moved. As Washington's men hacked their way west, another group was already there. French engineers and soldiers, moving down from the north, had taken one look at the same river junction and drawn the same conclusion. This is the key. They expelled a small British trading post and began building a serious fort, stronger, better sited, with more guns and proper defenses. They called it Fort Duquesne. Washington did not know that yet. He marched with the image of a British fort in his head and a French wilderness before him, not realizing that reality had already flipped the map. When he finally heard rumors that the French had beaten him to the punch, he had a choice: turn back with a report of failure, his ambition dented, or keep going, find ground nearby, and show that Britain still had teeth in the region. He chose the second. He would build a fort where he could claim what could be claimed, and wait for the next move. The Ohio country was not empty of politics or people. Around Washington's small force moved the interests of French officers who saw the British as intruders, British colonial officials who saw the French as trespassers, native nations, including the Mingo, whose villages and hunting grounds would be the battlefield long before Europe acknowledged it. One man in particular stepped into Washington's story: Denagrisson, often called the half-king by the British. He was a Mingo leader, trying to navigate a world where two European empires kept drawing lines on maps that cut straight through native lives. Denagrisson had his own grievances against the French. He had seen their harsh treatment. He had his own dead to remember. To him, the British were dangerous, but useful, a counterweight. When he joined Washington with a small group of warriors, it wasn't out of loyalty to the King of England. It was out of calculation. And calculation in a forest war can become blood very quickly. As Washington's men moved through the woods, news reached them. A small French detachment was nearby. Not a huge army, not a column with cannon. A party of around 30-40 men, moving through the trees, watching, writing letters, carrying messages. Washington's interpretation was clear. They're scouting us, preparing to push us out. If we don't act first, they will. To the French, their mission might have been to observe, to warn, to deliver diplomatic messages backed by the quiet threat of muskets in the leaves. To Washington, raised on English wars and hungry to prove his bravery, they looked like an enemy column, an opportunity and a threat wrapped into one. He spoke with Denagrisson. If the French were left alone, what would they do? The answer, from the Mingo perspective, was simple. They will report, they will call more soldiers, they will tighten the noose. Washington made his decision. We attack first. No declarations from London, No formal announcements, just a young officer in the rain, choosing to fire the first shot in a chain of events that would eventually be known as the 7 Years' War, a war that would burn from the Ohio forests to India, the Caribbean, and Europe. But right now, it was just mud, trees, and the tense silence before contact. They set out in the early hours of the morning, Washington, his Virginians, Tanagrisson, and his warriors. The forest was soaked, leaves dripped, the ground sucked at boots. They moved quietly as they could. But militia boots and European kit are not made for perfect silence. The goal was simple: find the French camp, hit them before they knew what was happening, capture as many as possible, and send a message that Britain was not afraid to act. Washington's heart must have been pounding. This was the moment he'd imagined since he first put on a uniform, leading men, taking initiative, writing his name in the opening chapter of a war. He got exactly what he wanted, just not in the way he hoped. The French detachment had made camp in a small wooded ravine, a shallow hollow surrounded by trees and rock. To Washington and his guides, it was an opportunity. They're in a bowl, we're on the rim. At dawn, through the dripping forest, Washington's force surrounded the glen as best they could. They crept into position. We don't have a perfect frame-by-frame record of those next seconds. What we know is this: the French were caught by surprise. The first shots came fast. Muskets cracked. Smoke boiled white and sudden in the damp air. Washington would later say the French fired first. French accounts insist the Virginians did. In the chaos of an ambush, everyone remembers what makes sense to them. The result is clear either way. Several French soldiers fell. The rest tried to form a defense, return fire, and then, realizing they were outnumbered and surrounded, began to surrender. Their commander, Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville, was among them. He shouted that he was on a diplomatic mission, that he carried messages, not invasion orders. But the sound of that didn't carry far over the ringing in men's ears and the thunder of their own heartbeats. The skirmish was short. Virginia militiamen and Mingo warriors had done what they came to do. They had scattered the French, killed a handful, and taken prisoners. For Washington, this could have been spun as a clean, brave success. We met the enemy and drove them off. What happened next would stain that morning with a much darker color. As the shooting died, the French survivors were rounded up. Among them, Jumonville himself, wounded but alive. Accounts differ, but the outline is chilling. While the French officer tried to speak, to present his papers, to explain that he was there as a messenger, Tanagrisson stepped forward. He had his own history with the French, a history Washington only partially understood. According to several reports, Tanagrisson declared something like, "You are not yet dead." Then he raised his tomahawk and brought it down on Jumonville's head. He split his skull, killing him in front of everyone. Some say he then washed his hands in the dead man's brains, a symbolic act in his own cultural language, a statement about vengeance and power. To French eyes, and later French propaganda, it was something else. Cold-blooded murder under the eyes of a British officer. Washington hadn't swung the weapon, but he was in command. It happened after the fight, not in the blind frenzy of battle. To the French, that made him responsible. In the panic and adrenaline of the moment, Washington's mind was probably racing. The mission had been to eliminate a threat. He had taken prisoners, valuable for intelligence. Now his native ally had just killed a man claiming diplomatic status. No one handed him a script for what to do next. So he did what young officers often do when the situation slips. He pushed on. He gathered the French prisoners. He noted their names. He wrote up the skirmish as an engagement with hostile forces. The forest quietly absorbed the sound of it all. But beyond those trees, the echo had already begun. In French reports, the incident at Jumonville Glen would become a case of assassination. In British circles, it would be framed as a brave preemptive strike against French aggression. The truth, muddy, damp, and full of misunderstandings, lay somewhere in between. What mattered was how each empire chose to tell it. Washington marched away from Jumonville Glen with prisoners in tow, and the strange metallic taste of his first real combat still in his mouth. He may not have realized it yet, But he had just done three things: spilled French blood in disputed territory, allowed the killing of a French envoy in circumstances the French would never accept, given Paris exactly the excuse it needed to claim that Britain had started a war. A line had been crossed in that ravine that no diplomacy could fully erase. In European capitals, ministers and ambassadors would soon argue over words like incursion, assassination, retaliation. But none of those men had been there that morning in the wet leaves with the guns still warm. For now, far from those polished rooms, Washington had a practical problem. The French would not let this stand. They would come back. And he was standing in the middle of the forest with a small, tired force, no serious fortifications, and a name that would be on the very top of their revenge list. He needed a defensible position. He needed shelter. He needed something they could call a fort. He needed it fast. What he would build, under pressure and bad weather, would go down in history with a grim sense of irony. A shallow, exposed stockade in a soaked meadow that would trap more water than bullets. He would call it Fort Necessity. Later, critics would say it should have been called something else. Fort Mistake. When you picture a fort, you imagine strength. High ground, thick walls, fields of fire sweeping out in every direction. What George Washington built in the summer of 1754 was almost the opposite of that. And the tragedy is that he built it because he had to, not because he didn't know any better. After Jumonville Glen, Washington knew three things. The French now had a reason to attack. He was deep in the wilderness with too few men and no serious fortifications. Reinforcements and supplies were far away. As he moved through southwestern Pennsylvania, he found a clearing in the forest, a broad, grassy meadow ringed by woods and low hills. With a shallow stream running through it to a tired marching column, it offered grass for the animals, space to set up camp, open ground where ambush seemed less likely. And there was another factor: the road. The clearing sat on a path that would matter later for any movement of troops and wagons. It was a crossroads in the making. Washington looked at this meadow and saw practicality. We can stop here, we can fortify here, we can hold here until help arrives. What he didn't fully weigh was how that same meadow would look to an enemy with more men, better support, and the luxury of choosing how to attack. Time was not his friend. Washington had a few dozen militia, some tools, limited food, no heavy artillery, no engineers trained in the classic art of fort design. He did, however, have urgency, so they got to work. What rose in the center of that meadow was not a star-shaped fortress with bastions and layered defenses. It was a small circular palisade of logs about chest height for a tall man, a shallow trench dug around it, a storehouse in the middle, some rough earthworks and firing positions. The whole thing was barely large enough to cram his men and supplies into. It had no real depth, no fallback line if the outer ring failed. From inside, it must have felt like a small island of order in a sea of wet grass and trees. From above, from the point of view of anyone looking down from the surrounding higher ground, it looked like a target drawn in the center of a bowl. The forest was never far away. Even after clearing some of the nearest brush, the tree line still pressed close. With more time, Washington might have cut the woods further back, opened wider fields of fire, created a cleaner killing zone. Instead, he had days, not months. Damp ground that swallowed energy with every step, men already exhausted from marching, digging, and fighting, so the woods remained. Closer than they should have been. Close enough that an enemy could occupy them, fire down into the fort's interior, stay relatively sheltered while doing it. That meadow was not a stage for open battle. It was a bowl, with his fort at the bottom, and tree-covered slopes for seats. All that was missing was an audience with muskets. As the days passed, Washington's world shrank to the size of the clearing. He sent scouts. He worried about supply. He tried to keep his men working, disciplined, alert. They were not professional soldiers. Some were eager, others already regretted ever having signed on. They grumbled about food. They complained about the mud. They argued about whether this fort would save them or just give them a closer place to die. Washington wrote, as he always did, reports to his superiors, entries in his journal, notes about the position and the land on paper. It still might have sounded manageable. We are entrenched. We await support. We can hold. But outside the fragile circle of his palisade, another story was unfolding. One in which he was no longer the hunter in the woods, but the man who had just wounded a much larger animal. And that animal was turning around. News of Jumonville's death did not take long to reach Fort Duquesne. There, French officers and their native allies heard the story in their own language. A French officer on a diplomatic mission had been ambushed. He had been killed after the fighting, not in fair combat, but in a way that felt like an execution. The British officer in charge was a young Virginian named Washington. Anger flared. Honor in that world was not an abstract word. It demanded an answer. The French prepared a force, around 600-700 men, accounts vary. A mix of regular troops, Canadian militia, and native warriors who knew the land intimately. Their commander, Louis Coulon de Villiers, had a personal reason to care. Jumonville had been his half-brother. This was no longer just a patrol. To de Villiers, it was justice. To Paris, it was a response. To Washington, who only knew that the French are coming, it was an approaching storm whose size he could only guess. If the French had designed the perfect weather to soften their enemy before they even fired a shot, they would have ordered exactly what the sky gave them. Rain, sometimes a drizzle, sometimes a pounding sheet. For Washington's men, the trench around the fort, filled with water. The low ground turned to mud. Muskets had to be kept dry with extra care, or they would misfire at the worst possible moment. For the French and their native allies, advancing through the trees, the rain was annoying, uncomfortable, but also a veil. It muffled sound, it blurred vision, it turned powder into a finicky risk, but it did something else more important. It turned Fort Necessity into a soggy bowl where the defenders would have to stand in water to return fire. The very earth had chosen a side, and it was not the side of the young Virginian in the center of the meadow. As reports came back that a substantial French force was near, the confidence of Fort Necessity's garrison began to crack. Men saw the low walls, the puddles forming in the trenches, the closeness of the tree line, the open sky overhead where any bullet fired from the woods could arc in. Some wanted to retreat immediately. We should fall back before we're surrounded. But fall back where? To abandon the fort would mean leaving supplies, leaving the wounded, turning a controlled position, however flawed, into a chaotic forest retreat pursued by men who knew the land better. Washington took the other gamble. We stand, we hold, help is coming. Maybe he believed it. Maybe he simply knew that admitting doubt out loud would finish morale completely. Officers walked the palisade. Orders were given. More logs here, more earth there. Check the flints. Keep the powder dry, keep busy. Because the alternative was to sit still and think about what would happen if hundreds of enemies took up positions in those surrounding woods. By early July, the shapes began to appear in the trees. French scouts, native warriors, movement in the undergrowth that was not the wind. The men inside Fort Necessity tightened their grips on their muskets. The Virginians' world had shrunk from the size of a continent to the few yards between the wooden palisade and the outer ring of mud. Washington was 22. He had wanted command. Now he had it. Around 400 men in a low, wet fort about to be ringed by someone else's guns. There was no way now to turn back the clock. Not on the winter mission, where he had delivered the British warning. Not on the ambush at Jumonville Glen, where the first blood had been spilled. Not on the choice to stop here, in this meadow, rather than fall back to safer ground. Every decision had led to this place. A small palisade in a bowl of grass and mud, under a sky that refused to stop raining, waiting for a French commander whose half-brother lay dead in a forest glen, and an empire ready to call this entire mess a justification for war. The first shots at Fort Necessity had not yet been fired, But in a way, the battle had already been lost. When a young officer, eager to prove himself, built a fort in a place where the land and the weather would fight harder against him than many human enemies ever could. The morning the French finally came, it didn't start with trumpets. It started with shapes moving in the trees. From inside Fort Necessity, the world was a blurred circle. Palisade mud grass trees. Beyond that tree line, Washington's men began to see movement. A flash of cloth, the tilt of a musket, the flicker of a feathered headdress between wet branches. The French and their native allies did not line up on the meadow for a clean European field battle. They slipped into position on the higher ground, just inside the trees, where trunks and brush could break a bullet's path but not their own. They were above the fort, under cover, close enough to fire, far enough not to be rushed easily. From their vantage point, Fort Necessity looked exactly like what it was: a low, shallow circle of wood in a wet bowl of earth. The first shots came from the woods, cracks and flashes from the tree line, muskets spitting fire and smoke down into the clearing. Inside the fort and the shallow outer trenches, Washington's men snapped to their positions. Militiamen pressed against the palisade tried to return fire between the logs. Others knelt or lay prone in the ditch, their clothes already soaked through, mud creeping up their sleeves. But there was a problem no bravery could fix. The French and native shooters could see down into the fort. The defenders could hardly see them at all. For the men inside, the forest edge became a dark wall full of invisible mouths coughing smoke and death. They fired at muzzle flashes, at movement, at guesses. The enemy fired at shapes, at silhouettes outlined. Against the pale open grass, it was not a battle, it was a shooting gallery. If the sky had cleared, if the sun had come out, perhaps the fight would have shifted. Muskets might have fired more reliably. Powder would have stayed dry. Men could have seen further. Instead, the clouds simply leaned in closer. Rain fell. Then it thickened, it turned. The ditch into a trough of brown water. The meadow into a sponge. Every step into a struggle. Men standing in the trench found themselves ankle-deep, then shin-deep in water. Some accounts remember soldiers standing on floating logs and debris just to keep their powder pouches out of the puddles. Every time a musket was loaded, powder had to be shielded from the falling drops. Flint and steel had to be checked, dried, fiddled with. Misfires hissed and died with heartbreaking regularity. The fort itself leaked. Water dripped into the enclosure. Mud smeared everything. The storehouse in the middle became both shelter and prison. The rain wasn't just weather. It was a second army, fighting on the French side. The sounds of the battle weren't just guns and thunder. They were orders shouted in English and barely heard over the storm. French commands carried through the trees, war cries from native warriors, who moved fluidly from trunk to trunk. Inside the fort, Washington struggled to keep some kind of shape. Rotate men at the palisade before fatigue and fear broke them. Keep sentries watching the low spots where an assault might come. Try to guess whether the French planned to storm the walls or simply grind them down with fire. For the Virginians, this was not the kind of fighting they'd imagined. They weren't charging heroically across open fields. They were squinting through rain, firing at invisible enemies, listening to bullets smack into wet wood inches from their hands and faces. Every so often, a man would cry out and fall, hit through a firing slit, taken in the shoulder, the neck, the face, dragged back from the palisade to bleed in the muddy interior. The men in the ditch had it no better. Exposed heads just high enough for a lucky shot from above, feet losing traction on the slick side of their own trench. Powder horns and cartridges constantly threatening to soak and ruin. Washington wanted to project calm. But every report that reached him said the same thing. We're getting hit, we can't see them, and it's only getting wetter. The fight went on through the afternoon. The meadow, which might once have looked peaceful, was now a churned-up field of footprints, blood, and water. The trench was half swamp, half grave. Still, the French didn't rush in. They didn't need to. Every hour, another casualty, another crack in discipline, another inch of water in the ditch. From the French side, this was almost ideal. Minimal risk, maximum pressure. An enemy pinned and stripped of options. From Washington's side, The options shrank to two: hold out and hope the French ran low on powder, or patience before his own men did. Find some way to end this before the fort became a slaughter pen. As evening crept in, the light failed. The rain did not. The flashes of muskets became more dramatic in the gloom. Brief, violent bursts of light in a gray world. Finally, the French fire began to slacken. Not because they were beaten, because their commander had something else in mind. He had proved his point. The British were boxed in. Their defenses were inadequate. He could theoretically keep this up until they ran out of men or nerve. But he had another weapon besides bullets. He had terms. One thing saved Washington from an even worse fate. The French did not decide to storm the fort. They could have tried. Rushing down the slopes, crossing the open ground under fire, climbing the palisade in a wave of bodies, it would have been bloody for both sides. Instead, they chose patience. Why risk men in close combat when the enemy was already trapped, tiring, soaking, bleeding? So they stayed in the woods, on the slopes, firing from cover. Every now and then, a group of native warriors would press closer, probing the edges, keeping the defenders on edge. But the main weight of the fight was musket fire. Fort Necessity was being worn down like a mound of dirt in the rain, not cut apart with a single blow, eroded. Hours passed. For men under fire, time warps. Minutes stretch into something like hours. Hours fracture into a series of vivid flashes. The face of a friend jerking backwards from a bullet. The feel of a misfire in wet hands. The sting of smoke and rain in eyes that can barely stay open. Some militia began to crack. They cursed the fort. They cursed the weather. They wondered aloud if they would ever see Virginia again. Others simply went quiet, eyes wide, doing what they were told, because doing nothing would mean thinking too much. Washington moved along the lines, visible, as a commander had to be. Tall, soaked coat plastered to his frame, he shouted encouragement, orders, anything to keep the rhythm going. Hold your positions. Keep your powder dry. Watch the tree line. Inside, he must have been doing his own math. How many men still fit to fight? How much ammunition remained? How long until nightfall? How likely it was that the French would finally attempt a direct assault. He had wanted a chance to prove himself under fire. He had it now, but in the worst possible terrain, under the worst possible sky. As darkness thickened, a message came from the tree line. The French wanted to talk. No more random shots, no sudden attack. They proposed a parley. For Washington, this was both a relief and a humiliation. A relief because his men were exhausted. The fort was a mess and there was no sign of rescue. A humiliation because agreeing to talk meant admitting that he could not simply fight his way out. Still, he listened. He had to. The alternative was to roll the dice on a night assault or simply wait for the next day's rain and bullets. So, under miserable skies, with lamplight fighting the drizzle, envoys moved between the lines. French officers, calm and controlled, presented their offer. The British could leave with honors of war of a sort, if Washington signed a surrender. A capitulation. Written, of course, in French. Washington could not read it. He relied on interpreters to tell him what it said. In the tired, sodden dark, under pressure, with men bleeding behind him, and the French calmly holding the upper hand, he made a choice. He put his name on a document that would follow him the rest of his life. A surrender that, in French, contained a word he would later insist he never understood. Assassinat. Assassination. By the time the French asked to talk, Fort Necessity was less a fort and more a wet box full of exhausted men. The guns had quieted, but the rain hadn't. And in that soaked silence, the most important shot of the day was about to be fired, with ink. It didn't happen like in the movies. No white flags waving slowly, no grand speeches in the open. It was messengers moving carefully through mud, voices calling out from the tree line, an officer edging out with a cloth in his hand, hoping nobody would shoot him by accident. From the French side, Louis Coulon de Villiers had already won what he needed to win. The British were pinned. They were clearly suffering. He had shown his men that Jumonville's death would not go unanswered. Storming the fort might have been glorious, and wasteful. Better, perhaps, to get the British to admit defeat in writing. From inside Fort Necessity, Washington saw the same facts from the other end of the barrel. His men were shivering and soaked. Ammunition and powder were not endless. The position was worse at night than during the day. Any assault in the dark could turn into panic. If the French were willing to let them walk away alive, he had to at least hear the terms. So he agreed to a parley. Imagine the scene. It's evening. The light is fading. Lanterns throw small, trembling halos into the rain. Officers meet between lines, boots sinking into the same mud that soaks the dead. On one side, French officers in damp coats, but with the calm of men who know they hold the better cards. On the other, George Washington, tall, tired, carrying the weight of every man inside that little fort. Somewhere beyond them, native warriors watch, faces unreadable in the dark. The French present their offer. We don't have a full transcript, but we know the essentials. The British may withdraw. They may keep their personal arms and some baggage. They must leave their cannon and some supplies. They must promise not to build again on that spot, for a period of time. And Washington must sign a formal capitulation. The terms were not generous. They weren't savage either. A middle road. We beat you. We could destroy you. Instead, we'll let you go, if you admit in writing that you were in the wrong. In the glow of lanterns, a document was produced, written in French. Washington did not speak French. He relied on interpreters, men who were themselves tired, wet, nervous, and not legal translators. The capitulation stated, among other things, that Washington's side had committed an assassination, in the death of Jumonville. To the French, this word mattered. It turned Jumonville from a fallen officer in battle into a murdered envoy. It painted the British action as not just aggressive, but dishonorable. It gave Paris a powerful tool in the diplomatic game. To Washington, standing there in the rain, the nuances of one French noun were not at the top of his mind. His priorities were, get his men out alive, avoid being crushed at dawn, salvage what he could of the mission and his own career. His interpreters told him, roughly, "It says we agree not to build here again for a year, and that the Jumonville affair is acknowledged." He later claimed he did not understand that the French text explicitly described the killing as an assassination. Whether that is true, partially true, or convenient memory, we will never know completely. What we do know is this: in that miserable moment, Washington signed. The next day, under gray skies and dripping trees, the British force prepared to leave Fort Necessity. It was not a triumphant march. They left artillery behind. They left some supplies. They left a fort that had failed them as much as they had failed it. Some of the wounded were carried on makeshift stretchers. Others limped. Some would not make it far. The French watched. For them, this was more than a local victory. It was a message to native allies. We can defend our claims. A message to London. Your young officers can be forced to sign humiliating papers in the rain. Washington's men trudged away, boots squelching, clothes stiff with mud and smoke. Behind them, Fort Necessity remained, a small scar in a big meadow. The rain did what it always does. It continued to fall. It washed away blood, softened footprints, erased sharp edges, but some marks cannot be washed out. De Villiers did his job as a soldier and as a propagandist. He sent reports describing how the British had been surrounded, how they had been forced to capitulate, how the affair of his half-brother Jumonville had been formally acknowledged as an assassination by the British commander himself. In Paris, this played very well. It allowed French officials to say, "We did not start this. We responded to a criminal act on our officer." It also framed the British as reckless aggressors acting through poorly trained colonials, exactly the image many in France already wanted to believe. Fort Necessity became, in French eyes, proof that Britain's American subjects were clumsy, violent, and easily defeated when properly handled. They did not yet know that one of those subjects would someday lead an army against both crowns. For now, Washington was simply le commandant anglais qui a signé la capitulation de la Grande Prairie. the English commander who had signed the capitulation at the Great Meadow. In Virginia and London, the story was told a bit differently. Officially, British reports emphasized the bravery of the troops, the numerical superiority of the French, the difficult conditions, the fact that the garrison had been allowed to march out with some honor. The assassination word was downplayed, ignored, or attributed to mistranslation. Washington himself would insist later that he had not accepted that characterization. To his colonial supporters, he was not a criminal. He was a young officer who had dared to confront the French, a victim of bad ground and bad weather, an example of how the British government had left its colonies thinly supported at the frontier. Privately, though, there was no escaping the fact. Fort Necessity had been a defeat. Washington's first independent command had ended in a disastrous position, heavy pressure, and a signed surrender. For a man whose entire life was built on pride and reputation, that was a wound. As the column made its way back toward more settled country, Washington had plenty of time to think. He knew now, in his bones, what it felt like to build a fort in the wrong place, what it meant to face enemies who used trees and rain as weapons, how quickly a small mission on a frontier could turn into an international incident. He had wanted glory. He got experience, the kind you don't ask for and don't forget. He would carry that day with him, the drenched ramparts, the misfiring muskets, the constant invisible fire from the woods, the humiliating scratch of quill on wet paper as he signed his name under words he could not fully read. Years later, when he faced Britain again, but this time as an enemy, he would remember, never let yourself be forced into a position where terrain and weather do the enemy's work. Never underestimate how a local skirmish can explode into a larger war. Never sign anything you don't understand. Fort Necessity didn't make his career, but it shaped it. Beyond Washington's personal story, the wider world had been stirred. The fight at Jumonville Glen, the siege of Fort Necessity, and the ink on that capitulation were now part of something larger. French politicians used them as evidence of British aggression. British politicians used them as proof that France threatened their colonies. Native nations watched and measured which empires seemed more dangerous this season. The result would be the French and Indian War in North America, the 7 Years' War around the globe, a conflict so large Winston Churchill would later call it the First World War. In that storm of alliances and campaigns, Fort Necessity would be a footnote. But for George Washington, it was the first chapter of a much longer book, the story of a man who learned, young, that you can survive a defeat so public it feels like your name is broken, and still find a way to become the symbol of a new nation later. The muddy Meadow didn't end him. It taught him how easy it is to lose everything. If you confuse courage with good judgment, Fort Necessity could have stayed a local embarrassment, a forgotten skirmish in a wet field at the edge of nowhere. But the world of 1754 was wired differently. Empires were like dry forests. All they needed was a spark. Washington had just provided one. Reports of what happened in the Ohio did not stay in Virginia. They crossed the Atlantic in the bellies of ships. Letters from governors, dispatches from officers, French accounts of Jumonville's death, and Washington's capitulation in London. Ministers read, French forts on land claimed by Britain. A British officer forced to surrender. French troops stirring up native allies against British colonists. It fit a pattern they already feared. France is encircling us, in America, in India, on the seas. In Paris, they read something else. Our officer Jumonville, on a diplomatic mission, was attacked and killed. The British commander has signed a document acknowledging an assassinat. We responded with controlled force and magnanimous terms. Each capital saw exactly the story it wanted. Neither was wrong from its own point of view. Both were incomplete. What mattered was the conclusion. We cannot let the other side get away with this. On 19 July 1755, Braddock's army crosses the Monongahela River near Fort Duquesne. They move in good order. Drums beating, flags fluttering, ranks dressed neatly, even in the messy woods. It looks impressive, until the forest replies. French and native forces, much smaller in number but perfectly placed, open fire from the flanks. The effect is devastating. British soldiers are packed tight, easy to hit. Officers on horseback are glaring targets. Smoke fills the trees, making it hard to see where the enemy is. The red ranks, trained for open fields, try to hold their ground, to dress their lines under invisible fire. Panic spreads. Men fire wildly, sometimes hitting their own comrades. Units blur, identities lost in smoke and shouting. Braddock himself is shot and mortally wounded. The army begins to collapse. Every mistake from Fort Necessity is now being replayed, but at a much larger scale. In that chaos, Washington becomes a different version of himself than the one in the muddy Meadow. He rides back and forth through the storm of lead, carrying orders, trying to impose some fragment of order on a collapsing force. Later stories will say, 4 bullets passed through his coat. 2 horses were shot out from under him. He seemed oddly untouchable. What matters more than the legends is this. He saw up close what happens when you march like it's Europe on a continent that isn't. How devastating French and native tactics can be against rigid formations. How quickly an army can dissolve if training and doctrine don't match the battlefield. If Fort Necessity was a lesson in bad terrain and weather, Monongahela was a lesson in bad tactics and arrogance. Washington survived. Many around him did not. As the broken remnants of Braddock's army fell back toward the east, the road behind them was paved with bodies and abandoned equipment. The frontier was on fire. And yet somehow out of these disasters, Washington's name did not sink. It rose. Not because he won, but because in both crises, he did not run. He did not collapse. He stayed in the saddle when others fell. Colonial newspapers and politicians began to shape a narrative. George Washington, the man who had seen the worst the frontier could do. The officer who kept his head when Braddock lost his. The Virginian who knew how France and its native allies fought. At the same time, in his own mind, another narrative formed. We cannot fight like this and expect to survive. The seeds of his later beliefs were being planted, that local knowledge matters, that rigid European drill is not a magic shield, that supply lines, terrain, and morale win wars as surely as bravery. Fort Necessity, Monongahela. 2 defeats back to back. To an empire, they were embarrassments. To Washington, they were an education. The French and Indian War did not end with these early blows. It dragged on for years. Massacres on the frontier, towns burned, forts trading hands, native nations constantly reassessing which side was less deadly this season. Eventually, Britain adapted. They sent commanders more willing to listen. They used local allies better. They committed more ships and men. By 1758-59, Fort Duquesne fell. Quebec fell after the Plains of Abraham. The French position in North America cracked and then collapsed. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris confirmed it. France would give up most of its North American claims. Britain now controlled vast, new territories. On the surface, it looked like a complete victory. But victories have bills. War is expensive. Ships, regiments, forts, supplies, none of it is free. When the smoke cleared, Britain looked at its accounts and saw something alarming. Huge debt, bigger than any previous war. Interest piling up like snow on a roof. They also saw a sprawling empire that needed garrisons and administration. New lands to police, native populations to deal with. Colonists who now felt less threatened by France, and therefore more sure of themselves. In London, one idea began to grow. The American colonies benefited from this war. They must help pay for it. New taxes, new regulations, new attempts to control what colonists could trade, where they could settle, what they could print and say. In the colonies, another idea began to grow. We bled in that war too. We fought on those frontiers. Why should decisions be made across the ocean without our say? Between those two ideas, a crack formed. It would widen over the next decade. Washington left the French and Indian War with scars, with a name people knew, with a deep, wary respect for how badly things can go. He returned to plantation life, married, managed land and slaves, entered Virginia politics. On the surface, he looked like any other elite colonial gentleman. Inside, he carried memories of men drowning in trenches of mud, the sound of bullets hitting wet wood, the sour taste of signing someone else's words in a language he didn't understand. So when, in the 1770s, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies started to fall apart, when British troops patrolled American streets, new taxes sparked protests, shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, Washington watched with different eyes. He knew what British regulars could do on the battlefield, how stubborn an empire can be once it decides it's right, how dangerous it is to go to war without preparation. And yet, when Congress looked for someone to lead a new, improvised army of farmers and volunteers, they didn't pick a man with a long list of victories. They picked a man who had survived failure. George Washington, the same officer who once surrendered in the rain at Fort Necessity, now rode out as commander-in-chief of an army about to fight the very empire he had once served. If you stand today in that quiet meadow in Pennsylvania where Fort Necessity used to sit, it's hard to feel the weight of it. Grass, trees, a reconstructed palisade for school trips and photos. It looks small, insignificant. But history is full of small places where very big things quietly begin. The chain that started with the shot at Jumonville Glen and the surrender at Fort Necessity didn't stop in that summer of 1754. It grew. It turned into the French and Indian War in North America, then into the 7 Years' War across the globe. By 1763, the map of empires had changed. France lost almost all of its North American territories. Britain gained Canada, dominance in the Atlantic, and a sense of being the most powerful empire on Earth. On the surface, it looked like victory, but victory came with a bill. War is a hungry animal. To feed it, Britain had borrowed enormous sums of money, built and maintained fleets, paid and supplied armies on multiple continents. When the guns finally fell silent, the Treasury looked at the numbers and saw something frightening, debt like a mountain. At the same time, Britain now had vast new lands to administer in America, native nations to deal with. After France's fall, frontier forts to garrison, all of that cost money. In London, the logic seemed simple. We just fought a global war that protected our American colonies from French encirclement. They benefited. They should help pay. So Parliament began to experiment with new taxes on colonial trade and paper, new regulations about where colonists could settle and how, a tighter grip on what had once been a looser, more flexible relationship. On paper, it was financial policy. On the ground, it felt like something else. You're treating us like subjects who bled for you in the last war, and now exist only as a wallet. In the taverns and assembly halls of the 13 colonies, men remembered the last war differently than London did. They remembered local militias marching out to fight on the frontier, families burned out by raids, colonial officers and soldiers dying in forests and at forts most people in London had never heard of. They remembered watching British regulars bleed at Monongahela, struggle to understand the land, learn slowly how to fight a war that wasn't just Europe with trees. Many colonists concluded, we didn't just benefit, we were partners. Partners don't like being treated as children with an outstanding balance. So when new taxes and acts arrived, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, they weren't received in a blank, peaceful landscape. They landed on ground, already seeded with memories of how the empire had behaved in the last crisis. In that brewing conflict, George Washington stood in a strange place. He was not a street radical. He was a landowner, a slaveholder, a member of the Virginia elite, a man who had once worn the British King's uniform and been proud of it. He had fought alongside British regulars under a British flag for British expansion into the Ohio Valley. He had seen firsthand the strengths of the British Army, its weaknesses in the wrong conditions, the stubbornness of British command. Now, in the 1760s and 1770s, He watched Parliament impose laws and taxes that angered his fellow colonists. He watched British troops come not just to defend against French and native enemies, but to police British subjects. He did not flip overnight, from loyal officer to rebel general. His transformation was slow, uneasy, but underneath the memories of Fort Necessity, Braddock's defeat, the way London had dismissed colonial complaints, were all part of the mental ledger he kept. When the time came to decide where he stood, those pages mattered. When the American Revolution finally broke out, with shots at Lexington and Concord, the siege of Boston, and the formation of a Continental Army, Congress needed a commander. They needed someone who understood war, not just on paper, but in rain and mud, knew British strengths and habits, could talk to both New England radicals and Southern elites. They chose Washington. Not because he had a string of brilliant victories. He didn't. His military record was mixed, marked by defeats and retreats, full of moments where keeping an army alive was victory enough. But he had something no one else had. He knew what it was to be outnumbered and outgunned in bad terrain. He had seen how fast an army can die when mismanaged. He had lived through the humiliation of surrender and walked away determined to never repeat the same mistakes. At Valley Forge, at Trenton, at Yorktown, you can feel the ghost of that little palisade in the Great Meadow. Washington, older now, was careful about where he chose to fight, when he chose to stand, and when to retreat, how much risk he would accept for glory's sake. He had learned at 22 the price of confusing courage with good positions. He would not pay it again. With a revolution on the line, in American mythology, Washington is often frozen, crossing the Delaware in a heroic pose, accepting Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, standing tall in paintings and statues. Fort Necessity rarely appears. It's a footnote, a quiz question, a roadside sign. But in reality, the man at Valley Forge and the man at Yorktown does not exist without the young, wet, frustrated officer in that fort ringed by trees. Without the ambush at Jumonville Glen, the confusing negotiations in the rain, the capitulation in French, Washington's story is missing its hardest, most necessary lesson. And without the war that followed, fueled in part by that first clash, the British Empire does not rack up the debts and political tensions that push it to squeeze its American colonies. Fort Necessity, in other words, is not just the place where Washington lost his first battle. It is one of the many small stones that began the avalanche. If you walk there now, you won't see lines of muskets or soldiers in red and blue. You'll see reconstructed palisades giving shape to what once stood, interpretive signs summarizing things in neat paragraphs, maybe a few tourists glancing at their phones between photos. What you won't see is the invisible, the damp weight in the air when a 22-year-old realized he'd chosen the wrong ground. The cold, sick feeling of signing your name to a document you can't fully read. The strange, long echo of a moment when nobody thought they were starting something world-shaking. But that's what history often looks like up close. Muddy, confused, wet, and much smaller than the books make it later. Only with distance do we see where the threads lead. In this case, one of those threads runs from a fort called Necessity to a city called Philadelphia, where 22 years later, some of the same colonies that fought in the French and Indian War decided they'd had enough of taking orders from the same empire and signed a very different document, this time in their own language. And this time, George Washington was not the man surrendering someone else's words. He was the one chosen to defend their own.